Welcome to the latest of our Socialist Action webinars. Tonight we're talking about the origins of the police and their role in upholding oppression, racism, private property, and the interests of the ruling class, with a presentation from our comrade Dave Reilly in the Twin Cities. Dave is a retired railroad worker and a local labor historian. Thanks for being with us tonight. Check us out on socialistaction.org, and we will be doing questions after Dave's presentation. So please put your questions in the chat section on YouTube, and we will do a Q&A after the presentation. Thanks.
Okay, welcome comrades and friends and relatives. There are nearly 700,000 police officers in the United States, about 2 for every 1,000 people, a rate that's actually lower than the European average. The difference is guns. Police in Finland fired 6 bullets in all of 2013. In an encounter in a single day in the year 2015 in Pasco, Washington, 3 cops fired 17 bullets when they shot and killed an unarmed 35-year-old orchard worker from Mexico. 5 years ago, when the Guardian newspaper counted police killings, it reported that in the first 24 days of 2015, police in the United States shot more people than police did in England and Wales combined over the past 24 years. American police are armed to the teeth with more than $7 billion worth of surplus military equipment offloaded by the Pentagon to 8,000 law enforcement agencies since 1977. I'm going to turn to the deepest roots of policing in North America by white people now. So I think I should direct your attention to the slide up there. It's become more widely discussed now in the last several months since the protests erupted after the murder of George Floyd, that one of the origins of police in the United States has been in the slave system in the US and prior to the formation of the US. That was intended to keep the slaves trapped within the plantations they were enslaved in. And anybody who was out, any African American who was out away from the plantation, they had to have a pass signed by his person who asserted ownership over him. And then you had to get another one on the way back. If you look on the screen there, you'll see an image from the slave era of an African American slave being captured by slave catchers. One of those abolitionist drawings that circulated in the pre-Civil War era. This is also a drawing depicting the slave catchers and the patrollers seizing a hapless enslaved person somewhere in the antebellum era. Take a look at this. You see on the left the badge of the slave patroller, issued, I think, by the state of South Carolina. And then on the right, the police badge of some of the current cops in the United States. This is a better look at that slave catcher's badge. Plantation Police, Georgetown County, South Carolina, 1858, Runaway Slave Patrol. So these were mostly the white riffraff of the South, who generally didn't have any productive work to do because the slaves worked in the fields, and most of the skilled workers were also enslaved people, like masons and carpenters, and of course they didn't have electricians, but you know, the building trades were dominated by slave labor at that time. So every slave catcher had one of those to carry around with them. There are two historical narratives about the origins of American law enforcement. Policing southern slaveholding states had roots in slave patrols, squadrons made up of white volunteers empowered to use vigilante tactics to enforce laws related to slavery. They located and returned enslaved people who had escaped, crushed uprisings led by enslaved people, and punished enslaved workers believed to have violated plantation rules. The first slave patrols arose in South Carolina in the early 1700s. I think 1704 is the date that generally recognized as the beginning of this. By the time John Adams became the second US president, every state which had not abolished slavery by then, which was all of the southern states, had a slave patrol, or many slave patrols working within those states. Members of slave patrols could forcefully enter anybody's home, regardless of their race or ethnicity, based on suspicions that they were sheltering people who had escaped bondage. The more commonly known precursors to modern law enforcement were centralized municipal police departments that began to form in the early 19th century, beginning in Boston and soon cropped up in New York City, Albany, Chicago, Philadelphia, and elsewhere. The first police forces were overwhelmingly white, male, and more focused on responding to disorder than crime. Officers were expected to control a, quote, dangerous underclass that included African Americans, immigrants, and the poor. Police corruption and violence, particularly against vulnerable people, were commonplace in the early 1900s. Additionally, the few African Americans who joined the police forces were assigned to Black neighborhoods and faced discrimination on the job. These factors, controlling disorder, lack of adequate police training, lack of non-white officers, and slave patrol origins are among the forerunners of modern police brutality against African Americans. This is now shifting to the north. This is probably depicted a mass demonstration in Boston, I would say, in the revolutionary or pre-revolutionary period. At that time, there were no modern police forces anywhere. The task of preserving the order that the society top dogs wanted was assigned to constables who were pretty much just people who wandered around with a club and a lantern if they were working at night, and also periodically would call out all is well, and most of the time I guess it was. This kind of thing is really uneven. We had a comrade, Carl Heck, here who came from Germany, was about 14 or 15 years old in Germany when World War II ended. And he came from a village, and his father was a town crier. So this is up until at least the late 1940s that they had this extremely antiquated form of what you might call law enforcement. His father just would walk around and see that everything was in order in the village, and one of his tasks was calling out the news of the village and what time it was, and assuring everybody that it was all well. So this is kind of the penetration of the past into the present and vice versa, I guess you could say. Obviously, at that time, the Nazi regime had plenty of modern cops and Schutzstaffel and all those kinds of entities, but they did have still this old time thing in the villages. So I'm going to show you here who policed revolutionary Boston. And this is kind of a depiction of what the masses were doing at that time to express their dissatisfaction with the status quo. And there were still just constables assigned to wander around and keep an eye on things. That what's really interesting to me is that there was Boston was not a very large city in terms we'd be familiar with, and there was were no barriers between where the masses lived and where the wealthy people lived. Just the wealthy people were in big houses a little further down the road, and when they got riled up, they would just march down to the houses of the wealthy and stone them or set them on fire or go in and loot them of their furniture. And there was nothing standing between the masses out protesting and rioting and the upper class. There was no real barrier there, so they were in tough shape as far as having their privileges protected. You can see the Boston police claim their origin in 1630. Of course, at that time they weren't much more than a bunch of night watchmen anyway, but that's the date they've assigned for their beginning. In England, the mass movement of the workers had taken the most advanced form that the world has seen until the beginning of the 20th century in the form of the Chartist movement, which was a massive workers' movement that demanded the passing of the People's Charter, which was a 6-point program. The primary one was universal suffrage. And at that time, nobody in the working class had the right to vote. The Chartists were an immense movement. They conducted giant demonstrations, marched on Parliament with petitions signed by 1 million people sometimes, and some, would be carrying something like a rolled up living room rug in terms of its dimensions. And they delivered a number of those to Parliament, demanding some elementary democratic rights. They didn't get them at that time, unfortunately, although they were the first class-conscious labor movement in modern times. They made a clear distinction between the middle class in Britain and themselves, and of course the upper class and the royalty. This is a fantastic photo from 1848 of a Chartist rally in, I believe, in Manchester. You can see there's tens of thousands of people here outside a giant factory. They're so big they have to have these numbered signs up like you'd see at the ballpark. And this was a rally to demand again the passage of the charter by Parliament. And you can see in the center there's a speaker's platform, and it's probably like Monty Python, in the sense that how could the people on the fringes of that immense rally hear the speakers? I don't know, I wasn't there, but I think even with a megaphone, that I just can't believe a human being could project their voice that far. But gives you an idea of the immense mobilization that was taking place in the working class at that time, and we say in the first 5 decades of the 19th century. This is a satirical flyer created by somebody in the milieu of the Chartists. A little hard to read there, I guess, but it's the guy with the helmet on is the police officer, and he's saying all kinds of good things and doing all kinds of bad things there. He's giving this guy a beating right in the center there, and at the same time he's talking about how he was abused by this miscreant who was laying on the ground. It looks, in light of what we've learned over the last 6 months, let's say, if we didn't know it before, it's very familiar. He's being terribly abused by the person who was laying on the ground, and so he's beating him in order to settle things. Here's some more cops just for comparison. This is 1935 in Minneapolis. It was a big strike at Flower City Iron Works in South Minneapolis. The building's still there. And you can see it's two men prostrate on the ground there. I don't know if the guy on the left is alive or not. There were just two bystanders who were killed in this attack by the police on the picket line, and many others injured, of course. So that's the kind of treatment that they got from the Minneapolis police a year or so after the strike against the trucking employers was one. It wasn't until the 1830s that the idea of a centralized municipal police department first emerged in the United States. In 1838, according to this, the city of Boston established the first American police force. I don't know where the 1630 date comes from. Followed by New York City in 1845, Albany and Chicago in 1851, New Orleans and Cincinnati in 1853, Philadelphia in 1855, and Newark and Baltimore in 1857. These were clearly this is a key thing to know, is that none of these police departments were created to deal with crime. They were created because of the movement of the masses, the insurgent workers marching on the various capitals and demanding their rights. And the formation in England of the Metropolitan Police Force by Sir Robert Peel was really the first modern, seriously organized police force that was created in a major industrial city. And it continued from there to begin to professionalize the cops. They gave them uniforms, but Robert Peel was concerned that he wanted to get some kind of acquiescence from the masses. Were alarmed about a professional police force creating a dictatorial, tyrannical system like they had in France. So he dressed them in blue uniforms instead of the red ones that the military wore. And they were unarmed. They've basically been unarmed until up into the present era, when they're now in the last couple of decades, they're starting to carry arms and confront the people in London with the terror of armed police. So more than 100 years earlier, in 1704, the colony of Carolina developed the fledgling United States Slave Patrol, which consisted of roving bands of armed white citizens who would stop, question, and punish slaves caught without a permit to travel. They were civic organizations controlled and maintained by county courts. The way the patrols were organized and maintained provided a later framework for policing and community policing, particularly in the South. In 1822, for example, Charleston, South Carolina experienced a slave insurrection panic caused by a supposed plot of slaves and free blacks to seize the city. In response, the state legislature passed the Negro Siemens Act, requiring free black seamen to remain on board their vessels while in Carolina harbors. If they dared to leave their ships, the police were instructed to arrest them and sell them into slavery unless they were redeemed by the ship's captain. And this type of legislation was also passed in the ports on the Mississippi River, like New Orleans, where the steamship traffic was pretty heavy at that time. Black sailors or other workers on these ships, stewards and deckhands and so on, were forbidden to get off, although nonetheless they did. And they always carried with them, at least in their heads, the latest news about what was happening with the resistance to slavery in the United States. And if they had some kind of printed abolitionist material, they brought that with them and they'd read it aloud to the slaves. In 1619, the first African bond laborers arrived in Virginia from Barbados. Not lifetime bond laborers or slaves, basically, but limited term bond laborers, just in the same category as the white workers. By 1650, there were about 300 Africans living in Virginia. They were still considered to be indentured servants, like the approximately 4,000 white indentured people, since the slave law was not passed in the colony until 1661. And on completion of their bond period, usually 7 years, they were released with a customary allowance of corn and clothes and a freedom allowance, which in some cases could be hundreds of pounds of tobacco, worth quite a bit of money. 1670, the first slave law was passed in Virginia, which created the category of lifetime bond labor, and also began to extend that in a hereditary manner to the descendants of the people who were being enslaved by that law. So that meant that you derived your status under the slave law from your mother, because, of course, in general, it was the African American women who were giving birth to children of color, and frequently the father was a white person. So your child was therefore inherited your slave status. This happened to be totally the reverse in England itself. England asserted that it was a free country and that anybody who set foot on its land was automatically free. So there were many, relatively many people of African descent who were free people of color living in Britain. In 1676, very disturbing to the slaveholders event happened, known as Bacon's Rebellion, led by a charismatic white guy named Roger Bacon. The Bacon's Rebellion was besieged, captured, and burned the colonial capital, Jamestown. The rebel army was composed mainly of European American and African American bond laborers and freedmen recently, quote unquote, out of their time, meaning they were no longer held in bond. They were free. They'd completed their indentureship. A century and a half before Nat Turner led his rebellion and William Lloyd Garrison began the Liberator, the armed laboring classes, black and white, fought side by side for the abolition of slavery. This was a epiphanal experience for the slaveholding class, because they had no intermediary third social layer between the planters and the workers, who were partially enslaved and partially in bond, but they associated with each other in a fraternal way at that time. And so this terrorized the slaveholding class and gave them the impulse to invent the white race, such as it began to be understood and defined in the South, so that they could create this middle layer of so-called white people who were granted some privileges that slaves didn't have, of course, mainly the privilege of being free and being able to work for wages and not much else. All of the 20 Africans who were brought into Jamestown, Virginia in 1619 arrived by the virtue of the slave trade. They actually became indentured servants. Thus, they eventually gained their freedom, and some later actually owned slaves themselves. By the 1640s, however, the practices of enslaving Africans for life and hereditary servitude, meaning the permanent enslavement of their children, had been established in Virginia, and within the following 2 decades had received legal recognition. In May 1723, the Virginia Assembly enacted a slave law that, in the words of Governor William Gooch of Virginia, in order to fix a perpetual brand upon free Negroes and mulattoes. And that was one of the decisive steps taken in terms of the law in creating a 3-tier system in North America and the South. And essentially it's continued to this day in one form or another. The Attorney General of Britain, who had overview of what was going on in these colonies in North America, objected. He said, "I cannot see why one freeman should be used worse than another, merely upon account of his complexion. Devoted elections of officers, either for a county or a parish, and is incident to every freeman who is possessed of a certain proportion of property, and therefore, when several Negroes have merited their freedom and obtained it, and by their industry have acquired that proportion of property, so that the above mentioned incidental rights of liberty are actually vested in them. For my own part, I'm persuaded that it cannot be just by a general law, without any allegation of crime or any other demerit whatsoever, to strip all free persons of a black complexion, some of whom may perhaps be of considerable substance, from those rights which are so justly valuable to every freeman." That's an eloquent dissent, but it didn't prevail, of course, in the face of the amassed property interests of the slaveholders. Okay, we're leaping ahead a little here, but these are Minneapolis cops being trained by Israeli police, who often use neon neck restraint on Palestinians when they aren't just shooting them in cold blood. There are about 200 Minneapolis cops that traveled to Chicago for a seminar with Israeli police who traveled there from the state of Israel to teach them how to brutalize people of color the way they do in Israel. And you can see there, one of their main devices is to use the neon neck restraint, as well as, of course, you see this guy is violently punching this restrained person in the face. Other Minneapolis and other cops were actually sent to the state of Israel for a nice vacation in brutality. These trips are financed by, some cases, by interested parties like the pro-Zionist American groups in the United States, and by private foundations like the Koch brothers and others. This has all emerged in the last 10, 15 years, I would say. So they're being trained, and you can see, since you've all been following what's been happening here, that there's been a immense escalation of the use of deadly force by the cops, particularly against young African American men, but not only that, second here. This is a document. I'll just hold it up here. I know you can't read it, but it's research and prepared by Communities United Against Police Brutality in Minneapolis. Stolen lives in Minnesota, people who have lost their lives through encounters with law enforcement authorities. And this is like 20 pages long, and pretty much just covering the 2000s. And these are all fatalities. Most of them, it's hard to say what if people of color predominate here or not. And there's certainly plenty of them represented, but there's also a whole bunch of white people who got murdered too by the cops using this drastic escalation of force that we see today everywhere, where the cops shoot people who are running away from them unarmed, and they pretty much empty their magazines, firing at them. 20, 30 shots is not unusual. And the inevitable result is that almost everybody that they shoot at is killed by design. That's the intent, is to kill. This is really a heartbreaking roster to read. There's a really high proportion of people here who were involved in some kind of mental episode, and in many cases, somebody from the family called the cops, who came in and killed the guy or the woman. A number of people here were just killed because the police were in a chase after somebody else, and didn't have their lights on or their sirens, and they were blasting through intersections and crossings, and people were just killed because they were intersecting with the cop car. Some familiar names here, like Jamar Clark, who was taken down and shot while he was handcuffed, laying on his face down on the pavement. There's another person here caught my attention. Was killed when 4 officers from the Washington County Special Response Team opened fire. Jeffrey's car had been pulled over in a traffic stop, and police claimed he failed to follow officers' commands. There's a whole bunch of these, not the majority by far, but where the survivors mainly sued the relevant police department, usually St. Paul or Minneapolis, settled for hundreds of thousands of dollars, which it's hardly adequate compensation for murdering a member of your family, and also an amazing amount of money that that these police departments pay out annually to buy their way out of these homicides that they commit. Many of these people were unarmed, and Another significant category of people here who died because they were denied medical care and had some underlying problem like diabetes or other chronic illnesses. And by the time they were delivered to the Hennepin County Medical Center, they were dead. This is, I'm not going to go through any more of this, but there's probably 1,000 cases in here. It's really sickening. So, fired Minnesota officers have a proven career saver. This is from the Minneapolis Star Tribune. Their career saver is arbitration. Unlike my experience arbitrating for disciplined and fired railroad workers who very rarely are reinstated through arbitration, especially with back pay. These three instances here are just typical of what usually happens when a cop happens to be fired or sit out for an extended period of time without pay. So one Minnesota officer was fired for kicking an unarmed suspect who was already on the ground being attacked by a police dog. Another was fired for repeatedly punching a handcuffed, intoxicated man in the face. The third was fired after failing to write up nearly 4 dozen cases, copying the judge's signature onto the search warrants, and lying during the investigation. They all got their jobs back, gun and badge intact. It just underlies the general immunity that the cops have to any kind of restraint. In most cases, as you probably know, if they're involved in shooting an individual, they put on desk duty. In other words, they get to go on a semi-vacation and get their full pay, and then after a while they go back to work. So there's another issue that meshes with this general immunity that the cops have. It's called qualified immunity, and it's a Supreme Court invented doctrine that gives police and other public officials broad immunity from civil lawsuits, even in cases where an officer of the law has clearly violated a person's federal constitutional rights. And this is a new pseudo official practice that has no basis in law or a constitution. Qualified immunity is not an issue in the prosecution of such criminal cases as that of former police officer, guess who, Derek Chauvin. This is not involved in the murder of George Floyd. This is just one of the other incidences that he was involved in. It's one of the many structural factors in the law that have bestowed broad benefit of doubt to police officers and made it next to impossible to hold them accountable for wrongdoing. That's the end of the visuals. Let's see. I guess I should stop here. 45 minutes. A lot more material here that supplements all of this, which just indicates that in general, the police are immune from whatever the hell they want to do, including stealing from the people they're victimizing, as well as beating them and shooting them. I think the thing to really remember here is that police violence is not a aberration, and it's not a mistake, and it doesn't come fundamentally from the depraved, sadistic inclinations of the rank and file cops, although that is abundantly present. This police brutality and freedom to kill is a policy that's imposed everywhere in the United States by the ruling class, who we tend to forget about. I think there is a ruling class. It's not just made up of Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg. It's made up of families that have dominated the United States for a couple of 100 years. The Rockefellers, the DuPonts, many others. And they really are the rulers. And they have the capacity to think ahead. And it's pretty clear that this escalation that happened in the completely brutal and vile use of force against unarmed people, particularly of color, started to emerge under the Nixon administration. Not saying that cops were sweethearts before that, but there's been an obvious, marked, visible change with these, the fact that every time they have a gun out of their holster, they're going to kill somebody, no matter whether they're prone on the ground with their hands handcuffed behind their back or whatever. And Nixon was acting on behalf of the ruling class, and at the time when the expansion of US capitalism had basically come to a halt in the early 70s after the reconstruction of Europe after World War II and of Japan. That was really the point where they saw far before we did that the crunch was coming, and that inevitably at some point the working class was going to be dealing with a severe reduction of their standard of living and so on, and inevitably at some point would respond and struggle. And I think we see the beginning of that with the tremendous mobilizations and solidarity with Black people and others who've been murdered by the police. So I'll just stop with that. I could go on quite a bit longer, but I won't. I'll try to keep within the time we set for ourselves, and be happy to entertain any questions or comments that anybody has and is entered into the chat box. So thanks for your attention.
Dave, on the history of the police, starting with slave patrols in the South and these organized police to discipline the industrial working class in the North and in England. We do have some questions here, and please, as Dave mentioned, put your questions in the chat. We're going to do a Q&A period right now. I see we have a couple questions out there so far, but yeah, please put more in the chat, and we'll be happy to answer them. The first question that we have here is asking about police unions. Could you give a brief rundown possibly on how police came to be unionized, and what do you make of calls to defund, disband, disarm the police, and disaffiliate from police in union organizations?
Well, police unions are basically gangster groups that have come together to defend their own narrow interests, which don't always coincide with what their masters want from them. And that's why they've got this reputation as being a completely vile, reactionary collection of people who think they should be coddled constantly because they have such hard jobs driving around in their squad cars and consuming donuts and coffee and occasionally having to get out and shoot some innocent person. I mean, police are not, if you look at statistics of the people who record injuries and fatal incidents among workers, police are not up there at the top. There's a lot of genuine working class jobs that have a much higher degree of injury and permanent injury and death than the cops do. They're historically, they were mostly always excluded from the labor movement. For instance, in St. Paul, Minneapolis, they've never been allowed to be in the central labor bodies or the larger AFL-CIO affiliates. I suppose there's a number of reasons for that, but the long experience of the labor movement with these gangster organizations is that there's just too much that separates them from authentic workers, and especially when there's a strike going on, and they're the first people across the picket line with their clubs to attack the strikers. And those experiences have gone very deep and are in the memory of even the most conservative members of the bona fide labor movement. Is there something more to that question?
Yeah, what do you, the second part of that was, could you speak to the calls to defund, disarm, and disband the police today? And we also have another question that's just come in. Could you speak to the constant propaganda that promotes police as the saviors of society, the thin blue line between us and chaos?
Yeah, thanks for the questions. Let me get back to the first one on could you kind of restate that for me?
Oh yeah, the disarm.
Oh yeah. Well, they're obviously an entity that shouldn't exist in a civilized society, and they ought to be entirely abolished. And policing, if to the extent that there's any necessary policing, should be done by people who answer to the communities they're part of, are selected in a democratic manner. They're going to be entrusted with that kind of a responsibility. The problem is that, which in the general sentiment is to just do away with the police in their entirety and give them all brooms and put them out in the street cleaning up garbage. But the deeper issue is what entity is there out there that can counterpose itself to the existing state apparatus and have the capacity and the social and moral authority to be enacting as keepers of the peace. That's kind of a tough one. In the 1960s, there was a move in many cities to, on the part of the black movement, to demand community control of the cops. That's something that we supported in the old SWP. We haven't seen it, and at that time, the leaders of the black struggle were authoritative people who had real roots in the community and were capable of creating an alternative to the cops in a realistic way. But I mean, what part of policing should be actually responding to violent and deranged individuals is one thing, but and obviously you can just review this excellent document that Communities United Against Police Brutality produced. See that probably a third of these arise from people who are having mental and emotional crises. And even if you assume that the police were telling the truth every time they claimed somebody had a gun or a knife, you know, which is obviously largely bogus. And there's been some good discussion about this, I think, in the course of these ideas about at least restraining the police have come up, that those kind of things are more should be the purview of people who are qualified in handling, working with disturbed people, not armed thugs who are motivated by sadism and brutality. I think it's not possible to just surgically remove the police from the capitalist system and then have a fine, humane system. We know that the police are a function of the ruling class, and they're generally autonomous in general, although they're supposedly under the authority of the elected officials of the given entity, village, or the city or the town. But just looking through all of these incidents, you can see that there's very few of those where there was any potential for violence against citizens. Most of the interactions with the cops and the people that they shoot are contrived, and of course many of them are directly a result of overt racism. Driving all black, there's also a lot of white people in there that also messed up on either consuming some really bad drugs like meth, or they're in deep trauma from emotional and psychological incidents and stresses they're acting on them. The one that has really struck me there is this is a little off the subject of whether the police should be defunded or not, but Fong Lee was a 19-year-old Hmong man who, about 15 years ago, I think, was murdered by a cop named Jason Anderson. And in looking at the details of this, you can see that Jason Anderson had got some visiting state trooper from out of state to ride along with him, and he was trying to show off. So he presses passenger, so he shot Fong Lee in the back. There's a kid running away, probably in terror of the fact that he was being pursued by a homicidal employee of the city of Minneapolis. And then amazingly, they found a gun near Fongli that actually, when they traced the serial number, found that its last known location had been in the property room at the police department. It was obviously one of these throwdown guns that police used to carry around as an alibi when they shot somebody without any reasonable provocation. So Jason Anderson went through 2 arbitrations and was reinstated with all of his back pay and everything else, and he's now the chaplain for the police department, if you can believe that. So this is I think that it's good that the general feeling towards the police department that's being expressed is negative and full of lack of trust in the capacity of the police to do anything positive, and they just turned loose as homicidal, deranged individuals who were wreaking havoc on the population that they choose to harass and pick out. You can see from what's going on with these things that have been embraced, say, by the Minneapolis City Council unanimously, that they're really just fakes and that nothing's going to happen of any great significance. They're just going to put different colored uniforms on the cops and send them out to, there's no way that the ruling class is going to give up this kind of MS-13 gang that they get to command. It is the first line of defense for a society that's based on inequality and oppression, and you can't just do it away. So I think as you follow this stuff, you're going to see that it's just like trying to chase a mirage. And the closer you get to it, the more diffuse it gets. They're not going to do anything. They're going to arrange to discuss this probably for a year, and then they can't. They've got so many obstacles to any kind of meaningful change in the whole structure of the city. The Charter Commission has voted down the proposal, and the Charter Commission has the last word on changing the city charter unless they submit it to a referendum. And so this thing is just not going to happen, in spite of the fact that it certainly raised the issue more acutely than it has ever been for many years. The Minneapolis police in 1934, who shot down 62 workers at Bloody Friday, none of them were ever charged with anything.
So as you say, to end the police requires or will require ending capitalism to a large extent. That as police are an outgrowth of capitalism to enforce its strictures upon the working class. That to end the police is a struggle against capitalism itself.
Right. I'm sorry I carried on there so long, but
and I think you've spoken to the need for the constant propaganda that we the question was talking about. Why do we have these constant cop TV shows that promote them as heroic saviors? Because
this has been going on for decades, if not generations, at least since the 60s, that they made the cops the heroes in all these TV shows. When you look back to the early days of the movie industry, the cops were portrayed as a bunch of clowns and klutzes, like the Keystone Cops in the Charlie Chaplin movies, and you got to see these things as related to the underlying development in capitalist society. Now you've got you've got the cop heroes out there. They've been around for 40, 50 years on TV, and we're just supposed to adore them, because they're, like Chips, right? Remember that? California Highway Patrol, they were just such cute guys. How could you not love them? They didn't kill anybody. They're like the Lone Ranger. They just shot the gun out of their hand at worst. So there's been this intense pro-cop propaganda, especially on television. I think you see less of it, although it's certainly present. You see somewhat less of it in the movies because people have to intentionally go to see a movie, unlike watching something on a boob shoot, and these cops just, they're always whining about what a tough time they have, and nobody likes them. It's kind of like Trump. Why doesn't anybody like us? And we have such a hard time. We're not a thin blue line, we're a thick blue line, full of donuts and coffee. And they're more and more, they're just recruiting the most thuggish and socially unstable individuals that they ever have. And I think I remember talking to Jim Griffin a while ago. He was one of two African Americans on the St. Paul police force when he got hired in the early 40s, and he eventually became a deputy chief. And he said he applied for a job in the police department because it paid a living wage and the work wasn't too hard, and he didn't have any desire to go out and confront people and beat them up or shoot them or anything like that. It was just that this is a good blue collar job. And that's kind of the way it used to be. Now they've got all these psychos that are, got one foot in these quasi-fascist movements and racist movements organizationally. And the only thing is that the ruling class understands that they don't want to overpay these people. They want to keep them at more or less the level of a well-paid blue-collar worker. So they don't. If they want to make more money, they've got to go out and find some bar or a liquor store that they can hang out and pretend to protect. But it's quite conscious. They're certainly pretty generously paid for people who don't do anything of any use to society, but the ruling class does not want them to rise to another strata of society. Too hard to handle them. So they typically get it. And I think part of the motivation there too is that they want them to be motivated to steal and to take bribes and engage in all the corruption that their occupation is heir to. That's all I had to say about that.
Being with us tonight. Thanks again, Dave, for that excellent presentation. Check us out at socialistaction.org. The next issue of our newspaper for August will be coming out very soon, so look for that online. And look for more of these Socialist Action webinars on our YouTube page. Subscribe to our YouTube page and Thanks for being with us tonight to learn more about our revolutionary socialist ideas. And if you like what you heard, get in touch with us, socialistaction@lmi.net, and check us out at socialistaction.org. All right, thank you.
Thank you. Good night.